it's good that you quoted John Locke. IRF, we have been holding reading sessions on the theory of John Locke. And I think I remember reading one of your articles when you said what Muslims need today is not Martin Luther, it's John Locke, right? Yeah. So, you know, these kind of ideas that we have to kind of discuss and debate in our society. And thank you very much. And I guess I would like to invite, you okay? Miss Dr. Patricia Martinez? Yep, to be a second one, yep.
Can you hear me? All right. I'm delighted Farouk asked me to respond because I've been reading a lot of Mustafa Akhil. I am a fan. I read that piece where you read Dabik, and you wrote about Irja and Murjia, and it resonated so much with me because of what's going on here. And so many of the things that you say resonate with me. So what I'm going to do is I'll quickly respond in 2 sections to what you said, because I would really like to expand a bit for us, and then I will do my own take on it. The first one was when you spoke about, you said we don't have an Islamic state in reality. You said, what kind of Islamic state? A Saudi state that's Salafi, an Iranian state that's Shiite? We don't have an Islamic state. Now, unfortunately, in Malaysia, in 2001, Dr. Mahathir declared us an Islamic state. And that opened a Pandora's box, because from that political move to undercut an opposition political party that was Islamist, he opened the door for so many things that now have our constitution, our secular civil laws and courts and so on in an absolute mess and tizzy. Here's the lawyer who can talk better about it. But I got into trouble because I read the book in Bahasa Malaysia where they promoted this notion of Dr. Mahathir's Islamic State. And they had used the Shafi'i jurist al-Mawardi, who died in 750, and his al-Ahkam as-Sultaniyah. But they distorted a lot of things. And so, for example, you're so right. There's pluralism, we can have the jizya and we can have the Christians, but there's the ruled and the ruling. And it was so interesting that what was mustahaqqa, mandatory, and what was mustahabba, encouraged, was completely reversed. So for example, where al-Mawardi had written a church should not, the steeple should not be higher than a mosque, suddenly became mustahabba, mandatory here. And we had a case 20 years ago where the Barizan government in Selangor gave permission to a Catholic church, listen to this, to build their church in a factory lot. We were not given proper grounds, go and put it in next to factories. And then the construction was stopped because they said, oh no, it's going to be higher than the mosque. And so I argued, this is not mustahaqqa, this is mustahabba. And if we're going to go along with al-Mawardi, why don't we have all the Muslims who are supposed to be riding horses and all the non-Muslims who can only ride donkeys? You know, why don't we just go all the way? But this sort of thinking continues. The other thing that I wanted to comment on that I really liked that you said was this business of the state and what kind of state and borrowing from the West. And I think that you've raised a question of integrity, because we want to say that it's an Islamic state, but at the same time we want to say we're democratic, but we won't practice the principles of democratic because we have the ruled and the ruling, and that's very clear in things I'm going to show afterwards. And at the same time, we want to be in the nation and in the good fellowship of the Westphalian state as we know it, the modern Westphalian state. And so I think there is, as you call it, a lot of confusion, and there's no real Islamic state. I am so glad you raised this. I wish we could have, a few thousand hours of discussion. Finally, when you spoke about deviance, and it was again in the sense of the Murjia and Irja, but you didn't continue with what was in your article, which is burnt in my memory. These people, this theology, this notion, disappeared into orthodoxy in this dynamic of bid'ah, heresy. So everything you don't like, you put outside and you call heretical. And that's exactly what happens here with deviance. We've got poor old sisters in Islam that half the world thinks the world of. They've been labeled as deviant by religious authorities. And I'm going to invoke a French philosopher, postmodern, Michel Foucault, who to me, if you choose to follow up, read him. He helps me unpack a lot of what is going on in Malaysia. And he defined deviance as this business of purely taking a person out of the normative because you have the power to do so. Not because they did something terribly wrong, horrible, hideous against humanity, but because you have the power to make whoever you don't like a deviant. Hello, Datuk Nur Farida. Into a deviant. And Foucault says that this is the modern way a nation disciplines. Foucault wrote about discipline. Disciplines its citizenry en masse, because before they had to have torture, and you're right, you referred to Christians and our Inquisition, burn people, spear them, do horrible things to them, Now we don't need to do that, Foucault says. We don't need torture, we've got discipline, because we give the common people, ordinary people, a notion that they have some power, maybe democracy, but we keep most of the power, and then we use our power to punish. And that is so very clear here in Malaysia, where a fatwa, which is the opinion, the revered opinion of a mufti, becomes criminalized. So there are actually laws enacted which say you can't question a fatwa, let alone disobey it. My friends in the Middle East fall over their chairs laughing when I tell them this. So we criminalize and call deviant what the state or what power, so let's just say power, because religious authorities are now extremely powerful in the instrumentalization of Islam in this nation, where politics and Islam have become fused to a certain extent for political expedience. I don't think I'm the only one who's going to say it. I don't think it's horrifying. So I'm very glad you raised that notion of deviance, because that's what's happening here. Shias are deviant, feminists are deviant. Qasim Ahmad, an old man in his 80s, who writes that the Quran has primacy. And my field was tafsir, where the first method of interpreting the Quran is the Quran. The second one then would be the Sunnah and so on. And Qasim Ahmad is simply insisting on the primacy of the Quran, and there he goes. He's being taken to Sharia court. He's being accused of all kinds of things. So those were my responses to you. I'm delighted with what you said. Thank you. Now I go to my own. I'll try and keep within the time, Farouk. In answering the question, could there be religious diversity in illiberal democracies? Mustafa Akyol said a categorical no, but he had a but. I would say they exist, but at enormous cost, and the cost is terrible. And I like what he said, if you're the majority in a foreign country and Muslims are the minority, now put yourself in the shoes of being here. Muslim minorities, as I've argued elsewhere, flourish in a nation which is secular, which is liberal, which is democratic, more or less truly democratic. I don't think there's a pure democracy anywhere. But they flourish because there isn't this notion of religion conflated with state. So my answer to the question that IRF poses is, yes, We can have religious diversity. It is a terrible price to pay because it's an illiberal democracy. But the second part of my answer is that we are fundamental and imperative in such an illiberal democracy. We are fundamental, religious diversity is fundamental and imperative in such an illiberal democracy. Why? Precisely because, unlike ethnicity, for example, which can be co-opted, you can be assimilated, religious diversity, religiosity, religious tenets cannot be changed. They stand firm on their own. And we then become that challenge to an illiberal democracy. And that's what's happening here, frankly. The way Christians are being demonized, Shiites are being demonized. Everything is a Christian plot. Just last week, Hadi Awang raged and ranted about Christians and we're missionizing. Till today, when we say, please give us proof of how many people we've converted, not one is given, but we're constantly conspiring, whether it's on Valentine's Day or when Hadi Awang feels like it, to convert every Muslim. The Sarawak report was described by a minister as a Christian conspiracy and a plot. Now, these things are not funny. I mean, you and I are educated and we understand and we laugh. But it's not funny for ordinary Muslims listening to this, even in sermons, in khutbah. Okay? So we are a very important element in an illiberal democracy, and we will stay here and we will challenge, but we need the support. Muslims who are considered outside the pale, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Taoists, people who have no religion, and so on. The next point I want to make is that I want to read from you, rather than go on in a long story about how bad things are and how many things have happened. You know all about them, the unilateral conversions and so on. I'm going to read from a document that is 30 years old. It was written in 1986 by the MCCBCHST, which is the Malaysian, I have to take a deep breath, the Malaysian Consultative Council for Christianity, Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and Taoism. In other words, the main religious minorities in this country. And in this document, which is a summary of a major paper, is written, I very brilliantly didn't bring my reading glasses, but I can read. The variety of different interpretations of the Sharia has led to different treatment of non-Muslims. So we recognize this more than 30 years ago. If you think about the fact that our nation came into being in 1957, 30 years ago we were still doing the rose-tinted glasses of what a lovely, harmonious country we are. We all live so happily together. We love each other. It's great being a Malaysian. This is the reality that was going on behind the scenes. They gave precise examples, which I'm going to read to you. Discrimination in Malaysia. In terms of places and population for allocation of a mosque, 1986, yeah, compared to for a church or a temple. In the Mukim of Plentong in Pasir Gudang, Johor, that's one example, for a mosque you needed 1,800 people population. You would be accorded 0.4 hectares. For non-Muslims, temples, churches, and so on, you would need 1,400 people, so a lot harder. And the spatial requirement is, in inverted commas, suitable standards, which is how we are ending up in shop lots or ending up in factory lots and so on and so forth. In Ipoh, it was 1,800 and you would get 1 hectare, 1,500 for non-Muslims and so on. the other issues also that were already raised in 1986, 30 years ago. Hindus and Sikhs use the word Allah, but now increasingly there are enactments which forbid us to use certain words. I don't know how many of you know this, but there are Sharia enactments, and some of them are civil enactments, where we can't use a whole lot of words, from kitab to Injil. In Penang, it is as ridiculous as they've included the word haji. So if I respect someone and I want to call him haji, actually cannot. If I followed this, most of us just ignore it. I would have to say, dear most respected person who went to the Middle East and did the Hajj. Hello, you know. Crosses have been removed from some of the mission schools. Now, of course, we've gone even further. If a developer up in Kedah builds a row of houses and the airwells look like crosses from afar, I don't know if you've been told this, Mustafa. If they look like crosses from afar, there was an uproar, and the builder had to actually paint over the airwells so they don't look like crosses anymore. I've studied Islam, I respect Islam, I love the Prophet. I cannot imagine that Muslims' faith is so weak that the sight of a cross alone is going to make you convert. But this is the kind of infantilization that is going on, and that takes me to my next point. I have written 12 years ago about what I call the core and periphery syndrome in Islam. The core is the Middle East, where Muslims bow 5 times a day and face Mecca, and therefore reify or deify the Saudis and the Salafi and the Wahhabi and everything. And in the periphery, where Muslims can't read the enormous, wonderful resources that they have in Islam, the diversity that you were talking about. So they are infantilized. The mediators, the religious authorities, then tell them what their Islam is. And they have to follow. And like I said, then there's a fatwa, and if it's criminalized, you don't follow, you get it. You talk like Qasib Ahmad, you get it, because you're deviant. So in this core and periphery syndrome, there is a really big problem of Muslims, ordinary Muslims, feeling that they don't have the right to question. And when they do question, like the guy in Ipoh, Farouk, then he got hauled off to Sharia court because he was asking questions of the religious authorities. We all ask questions. I'm a Catholic. I have severe problems about certain things in Catholicism. I'm a devout Catholic. But it doesn't mean that, wow, whoopee-doo, everything's fine and dandy. We do ask questions if we are truly seeking to understand and love our faith. In the periphery also, a lot of the texts are not translated, so I congratulate IRF and others who are translating the texts into Bahasa Malaysia. But then we also go into the whole realm of what's banned. So this is about power. So much of this is not about, as non-Muslims, people of other faith, I sometimes dislike saying non-Muslims, what people of other faith think is Islam law, Islam like that law. And then I get beaten up when I speak to people of other faith and there are no Muslims present, and I'm trying to show them the varieties in Islam, the compassion. The Quran reverberates with compassion and mercy. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And there's so many times when I write over strong, cruel actions taken against Muslims, first of all, and then those of us of other faiths. Where is that compassion? Where is that mercy? But this is the core and periphery problem. And in Malaysia in particular, it becomes an infantilization problem. During my research, I would go and interview very prominent figures who were not Muslim authorities. They could pontificate on everything, on democracy, on economics, and so on. When I spoke to them about Islam and asked them, what do you think of, for example, the current uproar? We have uproars like every other month, right? What do you think of this current uproar? Immediately, No, Patricia, please don't ask me this question. I cannot answer la. I don't want to answer. Okay, you know what they say, I follow la. You know, don't la. We don't want. And I call that an infantilization. And I call that you've got to take responsibility for it too. And my final point about this business of infantilization is also the fact that our education system is skewed so badly that when I say to a group, this is only the second time I've come out in many years, I withdrew completely for many reasons. Assalamu alaikum, dead silence in the room at the Ideas Conference because, hey, this is not a Muslim. So I said, you should answer me, wa alaikum salam. And all you're saying is wa and alaikum, with you, salam, peace. And do you know in church, we Christians, halfway through the service, have to turn to each other and say, peace be with you. And yet it is forbidden of us. When one of my professors, when I first went to Jordan, said to me, Assalamu alaikum, Patricia. I just looked at him, and he said, don't be rude. And I cried. I burst into tears. I said, I cannot say those words. He said, what rubbish. So I loved it when I could say, Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum salam. So it is up to us as non-Muslims to know our rights. Can more of you please go and study Islam also? Can more of you stand up and support civil society groups that are Muslims and not just the ones that are not? Support IRF, support Sisters in Islam and so on, because we're in this together. Yeah? We're in this together. We can have religious diversity. It is becoming increasingly difficult, but again, it is imperative. We are the conscience. We are the challenge to an illiberal democracy by saying, what are you going to do with us? Because we're not going to change. And someone like me is not going to leave. Thank you.